the dim workshops of medieval Europe, beneath cathedral spires and behind monastery walls, physicians crushed beetles into powder, sealed cockroach fragments into pills, and prescribed ground insects as medicine. It sounds absurd, almost grotesque, through modern ears. But between 1100 and 1500, these remedies made sense. Explores how insect medicine emerged not from ignorance, but from logic, Aristotelian logic, theological logic, humoral logic, and how fear, authority, scarcity, and spectacle transformed crawling creatures into cures. This is not a story about superstition. It is a story about belief systems under pressure, about how power performs certainty, about how fragile bodies and fragile societies seek control in unpredictable worlds. And at its heart lies one unsettling truth. When knowledge feels uncertain, ritual becomes certainty. A beetle shell cracks beneath a pestle. The sound is sharp, deliberate. Powder rises in a thin cloud through candlelight, and you are about to swallow it. It's the year 1284. You're standing inside a narrow apothecary shop in northern Italy, perhaps in Bologna, where one of Europe's oldest universities hums with new medical authority. The room smells of dried rosemary, vinegar, smoke, and something faintly bitter, earthy. Shelves climb toward a soot-darkened ceiling, ceramic jars painted in cobalt blues. Bundles of herbs hang upside down like suspended forests. On the table before you, ground beetle powder, fragments of dried cockroach, honey, wine. The apothecary works carefully, methodically. Outside, the street murmurs, hooves on stone, vendors shouting. Somewhere far off, a cathedral bell counts the hour. You are not here for curiosity. You are ill. Your fever has lingered for 3 days. Your neighbor recommended this man. He does not hesitate as he seals the mixture into a small dark pellet. You hesitate, but you swallow. Because this makes sense. And that is where our story begins. If you're drawn to overlooked corners of history like this, where the strange becomes understandable, consider subscribing. We're going deep for the next 5 hours. But before we move further, ask yourself, if you lived here, what would you refuse to believe? Or would you believe everything that promised relief? To modern ears, ingesting ground beetles sounds primitive, but medieval medicine was not chaos. It was structured. Between 1100 and 1500, European medicine rested largely on the inherited framework of Galenic humoral theory, derived from the Greek physician Galen, 2nd century CE, preserved and transmitted through Arabic and Latin texts. The core idea was simple. The human body contained 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health meant balance. Illness meant imbalance. Every substance in the world possessed qualities: hot, cold, wet, dry. A fever was excess heat. A damp cough required drying. And here's the part most people miss. Insects were not random ingredients. They were categorized. Ground beetles, for example, were often described in medical manuscripts as drying and warming. Cockroaches, less commonly formalized in elite texts but present in vernacular remedies, were associated with drawing out corruption. In a world obsessed with balance, drying a wet disease made sense. It was internal arithmetic. And here's where history shifts. Medieval Europe, between 1100 and 1300, was not stagnant. Universities emerged in Bologna, Paris, Oxford. Medical faculties formalized curricula. Latin translations of Arabic medical authorities like Avicenna circulated widely. Apothecaries became licensed professionals in many cities by the 13th century. This wasn't fringe magic. It was structured medicine, and structure breeds confidence. When knowledge feels uncertain, ritual becomes certainty. But here's where it gets complicated, because medieval medicine was not only about chemistry, it was about theology. Christian doctrine held that God created nothing without purpose. Every creature, even the lowliest crawling beetle, had meaning. To dismiss a creature as useless would border on theological arrogance. And so, insects were not merely substances, they were part of divine design, which meant they could heal, not because they were pleasant, but because they were placed here intentionally. Think about modern wellness culture. Today, we swallow activated charcoal, collagen powders, mushroom extracts branded with sleek typography. We trust packaging. We trust influencers. We trust institutions with Latin names. The medieval apothecary was not so different from a modern supplement brand. Authority was visual. Ritual was persuasive. The grinding, the measuring, the sealing. It signaled competence. By the late 13th century, many European cities regulated apothecaries. In 1240, the medical licensing edict attributed to Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II in southern Italy required physicians to undergo formal training and separated physicians from apothecaries in professional roles. Records from Italian city-states show apothecaries inspected for ingredient quality. Medical manuscripts, such as the Tarquinum Sanitatis, circulating in the 14th century, catalogued foods and substances by their humoral properties. While insect remedies appear more frequently in vernacular recipe books than elite university texts, records suggest their inclusion in compounded treatments for skin ailments and digestive disturbances. Historians debate how widespread cockroach-based remedies were in elite medicine, but sources agree insects were part of the pharmacological landscape, not dominant, not bizarre, present. So here we are, a fever, a pellet of ground beetle, a theological worldview that insists everything has purpose, a medical system built on balance, licensed professionals, structured theory, and a society that sees logic where we see revulsion. This wasn't madness, it was coherence. But coherence is fragile, and within 60 years of that imagined apothecary visit, Europe would face a catastrophe so vast that beetle powder would feel almost gentle by comparison. Because when plague arrives, people don't abandon strange medicine, they multiply it. And what begins as structured logic becomes something far more desperate. A physician lifts your wrist. 2 fingers press lightly against your pulse. He closes his eyes, not to guess, to calculate. It's 1322. You are seated on a wooden stool in a stone chamber near the medical faculty in Paris. Outside, the Seine moves quietly under grey sky. Inside, the air smells of ink, vellum, and wool cloaks damp from rain. The physician before you has studied texts preserved for over 1,000 years. He is not improvising. On his table lies a Latin manuscript, copied from earlier Arabic, translations of Galen and Hippocrates. Margins are filled with careful notes. He examines your urine in a glass flask, holding it toward a narrow window where pale light filters through. He notes its color, its thickness, its sediment. Your pulse feels rapid. Your skin is warm. He nods slowly. Too much heat, too much dryness, an imbalance. He does not think in terms of bacteria. He thinks in terms of qualities. And this is the key. Between 1100 and 1500, European medicine operated largely within the framework of humoral theory, inherited from ancient authorities and preserved through Islamic scholars before re-entering Western Europe via translation movements in Spain and Italy. The system was elegant. Everything in the universe could be described through four qualities: hot, cold, wet, dry. These corresponded to the four humours: blood, hot and wet; phlegm, cold and wet; yellow bile, hot and dry; black bile, cold and dry. Health meant equilibrium. Disease meant imbalance. This wasn't superstition, it was cosmology. The human body mirrored the universe. Macrocosm and microcosm reflected each other. And here's what most people miss. The system was internally consistent. If a fever was hot and dry, then treatment required cooling and moistening. If digestion was sluggish and cold, warming substances were prescribed. Ground beetles, categorized in certain remedy traditions as warming and drying, could theoretically counteract excessive moisture. Cockroaches, associated in some vernacular traditions with dissolving obstructions, were thought to break up stagnation in the body. It was not about taste, it was about qualities. When knowledge feels uncertain, ritual becomes certainty. Imagine living in a world without microscopes, without germ theory, without anesthesia, but with centuries of written scholarship insisting that balance governs health. You would not see chaos, you would see equations. And this is where history becomes psychologically fascinating. People were not believing randomly. They were trusting a system that had intellectual lineage. By the 13th century, universities like those in Bologna and Paris required medical students to study Galenic texts as core curriculum. Dissections, though limited, were occasionally performed in some Italian universities by the late 13th and 14th centuries. There was investigation, there was categorization, there was debate. The presence of insect ingredients was not anti-scientific, it was system compliant. But here's where it gets complicated. Humoral theory did not operate in isolation. It intersected with astrology, with seasonal theory, with age and temperament. Your birth month could influence your bodily balance. Spring was associated with blood, autumn with melancholy. So if you fell ill in a damp autumn, the prescription might shift. Medicine was not only about your body, it was about time itself, which meant the physician's authority extended beyond the physical. He interpreted the cosmos for you. Think about how today's data-driven wellness apps track your sleep, hydration, mood, menstrual cycle, step count, stress levels. The medieval physician did something conceptually similar. He interpreted patterns. He layered variables. He presented himself as a translator of complexity. The difference isn't that one believed in nonsense and the other in science. The difference is the underlying model of how the world works. And models are powerful. They shape what counts as evidence. In 1316, the influential surgical text Chirurgia Magna by Guy de Chauliac, later physician to the papal court in Avignon, would reinforce Galenic principles for generations. University statutes in places like Paris required medical training to span years of textual study before practice. Pharmacy guild regulations in Italian cities mandated adherence to recognized compendia for compound preparation. Records suggest insect-based remedies appear more frequently in household and regional recipe collections than in elite surgical manuals. Historians debate how standardized such treatments were. but they existed within the framework, not outside it. There is something else. Insects occupy a boundary space. They live in soil, in cracks, between decay and regeneration. In a worldview obsessed with balance, such creatures symbolize transformation. Dry earth becoming life, decay becoming movement. To grind them into powder was not simply pharmacological. It was symbolic compression. You were ingesting transformation, not randomly, intentionally. So now we understand the architecture. 4 humors, 4 qualities. Cosmic correspondence, licensed physicians, guild-regulated apothecaries, a system that valued balance over eradication. Within that structure, a beetle was not grotesque. It was functional, logical, even elegant. But logic depends on stability, and medieval Europe was not stable. Political tension simmered. Climate shifts altered harvests. Urban populations swelled. And soon, a catastrophe would test whether this elegant system could survive reality. Because when plague arrives, balance is no longer theoretical. It becomes survival. A quill scratches across parchment. Outside the monastery walls, winter presses in. Inside, a monk carefully draws a beetle in the margin of a medical text. Not as decoration, as knowledge. It's 1179. You are standing inside a Benedictine monastery, somewhere in what is now southern Germany. The air smells of beeswax and damp stone. The cloister is quiet, except for the faint echo of chanting drifting from the chapel. In the scriptorium, long wooden tables are arranged near tall, narrow windows. Pale light filters in, illuminating parchment stretched taut across desks. A monk bends over a manuscript. His fingers are stained black with ink. Before him lies a Latin translation of an older medical authority, copied, preserved, and recopied for generations. In the margins, he adds a small illustration, a ground beetle carefully detailed. He labels it with notes about its qualities: dry, warm, useful in certain preparations. You might expect disgust. Instead, you sense reverence, because in this space, nothing created by God is trivial. Between 1100 and 1300, monasteries were not only religious centers, they were intellectual vaults. Long before universities formalized medical curricula, monastic scriptoria preserved classical texts that might otherwise have vanished. Greek medical authorities like Galen survived in part because of translation movements in the Islamic world and subsequent retranslations into Latin in places like Toledo in the 12th century. Monks copied these texts. They also copied herbals, bestiaries, compilations of remedies. And here's a crucial point. Medieval bestiaries did not separate biology from theology. Animals were moral symbols. Natural phenomena were divine language. A lion represented Christ. A pelican symbolized sacrifice. Even insects carried meaning. Beetles, creatures of earth and decay, were often associated with transformation and regeneration. To us, a beetle is a pest. To them, it was a participant in God's architecture. And this is where belief deepens. When knowledge feels uncertain, ritual becomes certainty. But when theology reinforces knowledge, it becomes unshakable. Medieval Christian theology rested on a profound assumption. Creation is purposeful. If God is perfect, then creation is ordered. If creation is ordered, then even unpleasant creatures have function. To declare something useless would imply divine inefficiency. That was not a minor theological error. It bordered on heresy. So when insect-based remedies appeared in manuscripts, they were not embarrassing footnotes. They were part of a worldview that refused to waste creation. This mattered psychologically. It meant medicine was not simply chemical, it was moral. To use what God provided was obedience. But here's where it gets complicated. Monasteries were not medical democracies. Access to manuscripts was limited. Literacy was restricted. Knowledge moved slowly and hierarchically. And as universities emerged in the 12th and 13th centuries, tensions formed between monastic knowledge and scholastic medicine. Who had authority? The cloistered monk or the university-trained physician? And when insect remedies appeared in both spaces, but framed differently, that tension became subtle but important. Consider how today's health advice circulates. Peer-reviewed journals publish data. Influencers reinterpret it. Blogs simplify it. Corporations brand it. Authority fragments. In the 12th and 13th centuries, a similar shift occurred. Monastic scriptoria preserved knowledge. Universities standardized it. Apothecaries commercialized it. Each layer reshaped how remedies, including insect-based ones, were understood, not unlike how a wellness trend moves from lab study to Instagram reel to store shelf. The 12th century translation movement in Toledo reintroduced major medical authorities into Latin Europe. By 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council required better clerical education, indirectly reinforcing literacy and textual transmission within religious institutions. The Physica, attributed to Hildegard of Bingen in the 12th century, includes discussions of various natural substances and their healing properties. Though historians debate how much reflects her authorship versus later compilation. Insect remedies appear more frequently in vernacular medical compilations of the 13th and 14th centuries than in formal scholastic texts, suggesting layered transmission between elite and popular medicine. Sources disagree on how standardized these remedies were, but they circulated, quietly, persistently. Now imagine ingesting a beetle, not as punishment, not as spectacle, but as alignment. You are incorporating something that survives in darkness, something resilient, something that thrives where others decay. There is psychological power in that act. The boundary between medicine and ritual blurs, between pharmacology and symbolism. And medieval Europe did not draw those boundaries sharply. So in monasteries, knowledge was copied. In bestiaries, creatures carried meaning. In theology, nothing was purposeless. In medicine, balance governed health. And within that web, insect remedies were not fringe curiosities. They were coherent. They were integrated. They were justified. But coherence survives best in stability. And Europe was entering a century of tension. Climate anomalies shortened growing seasons. Urban populations expanded. Trade intensified. And somewhere far beyond monastery walls, ships were carrying something invisible. Something that would test not only medicine, but faith itself. A bell tolls once, then again, then again. It does not stop. SFX, slow tolling bell, wound over empty street. The apothecaries' shelves are nearly bare. And now, even beetle powder feels small. It is 1348. You are standing in a narrow street in Florence. The summer air is thick, too still. Windows are shuttered. A cart rolls slowly past you, wooden wheels grinding against stone. No one speaks loudly. The bell from a nearby church counts another death. You feel fever rising in your body. Your neighbor collapsed yesterday. 3 days before that, she was laughing in this same street. Inside the apothecary shop, the usual smells of herbs and vinegar are overwhelmed by something sharper: burned rosemary, sulfur, desperation. On the counter, ground beetle powder, dried roots, resins, fragments of insects once prescribed calmly for minor ailments. Now they are part of compounds meant to repel death itself. The apothecary works faster than before. He does not claim certainty, but he cannot afford doubt, and neither can you. The Black Death arrived in Europe in 1347, likely via Genoese trading ships from the Black Sea. By 1351, it had killed an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population. Historians debate precise numbers, but the demographic collapse was staggering. Cities like Florence, Paris, and London saw mortality on scales unimaginable in previous centuries. Humoral medicine did not disappear, it intensified. If disease was imbalance, plague was catastrophic imbalance. Excess heat, corrupted air, poisoned humors. Physicians prescribed bloodletting in some cases, cooling syrups in others, aromatic compounds to purify the air. And yes, animal and insect components remained part of certain remedies, because the framework had not changed. Only the stakes had. Here's what most people misunderstand. In crisis, systems do not immediately collapse. They double down. When knowledge feels uncertain, ritual becomes certainty, and plague made certainty priceless. Imagine watching neighbors die within days. No antibiotics, no vaccines, no clear explanation. You would not abandon structure lightly. You would cling to it. The physician still consulted pulse and urine. The apothecary still measured ingredients carefully. The rituals of preparation mattered more than ever, because ritual signaled control, and control, real or perceived, reduced terror. But here's where it gets complicated. The scale of death began to undermine confidence. University-trained physicians sometimes fled cities. Clergy died administering last rites. Apothecaries ran out of ingredients. The theory remained intact, but its outcomes faltered. And when outcomes falter, authority trembles. Some communities blamed miasma, bad air. Others blamed divine punishment. Others blamed minorities, tragically leading to violent scapegoating, particularly against Jewish communities in parts of Europe. Medicine was no longer just about balance. It was about fear. Think about a modern public health crisis, when information shifts daily, when experts revise recommendations, when trust erodes. In those moments, people search for certainty anywhere it appears. Alternative remedies surge. Conspiracy theories spread. Authority becomes fragile. The 14th century experienced its own version of this dynamic, without the stabilizing benefits of modern science. The Florentine writer Giovanni Boccaccio described the devastation in the introduction to the Decameron, circa 1353, noting social breakdown and mass mortality. Municipal records from Italian cities show attempts at quarantine measures. By the late 14th century, Ragusa, modern Dubrovnik, instituted isolation policies in 1377. Medical treatises written during and after the plague continued to operate within humoral frameworks, emphasizing purification and balance. Insect-based remedies appear sporadically in surviving recipe books of the period, though historians debate their prevalence relative to herbal and mineral compounds. What is clear is this: plague did not immediately overthrow the old system. It strained it. In times of plague, insect took on additional symbolic weight. Fleas, though not yet understood as disease vectors, were observed in abundance. Decay seemed animated. The boundary between corruption and life blurred. To ingest something that lived in decay, like a beetle, could feel paradoxically powerful. You were internalizing resilience, transformation, survival. So now the world shifts. The Black Death devastates Europe between 1347 and 1351. Humoral theory remains dominant. Ritual intensifies. Authority strains but persists. Insect remedies remain part of the pharmacological landscape, not dominant, not miraculous, but present within compounded cures. And fear becomes the new constant. But plague does something else. It rearranges society. Labor shortages, wealth redistribution, urban restructuring, new regulations, new anxieties, and in the cities rising from mass death, a new kind of medical professional begins to emerge. Not just healer, not just scholar, but performer. Because survival now requires something more than theory. It requires spectacle. A jar is lifted high. Inside, something dark, fragmented, unfamiliar. The apothecary turns it slowly toward the light. He lets you see it. He wants you to see it. SFX, low murmur of marketplace. It's 1389. You're standing in a crowded market street in Florence. The plague waves have receded, for now. But their memory lingers like smoke in fabric. The apothecary's shop is open wide to the street. Shelves gleam with ceramic jars painted in bright enamel blues and yellows. Mortars sit prominently near the front table, not hidden in back rooms. The smell is complex. Spices, vinegar, dried herbs, beeswax. People pass slowly, peering in. Some curious, some skeptical, some desperate. The apothecary grinds something in full view of customers. He measures carefully. He consults a manuscript. He nods gravely. He is not just preparing medicine. He is staging reassurance. And you realize something subtle. After catastrophe, performance becomes survival. The Black Death altered European society profoundly. Labor shortages empowered workers. Urban wealth shifted. Guilds gained leverage. And in cities, professional identity became more regulated. Apothecaries were often organized into guilds by the 13th and 14th centuries in Italian city-states and elsewhere. Guild statutes governed ingredient quality, shop inspections, pricing practices, apprenticeship training. This regulation served practical purposes, but it also built trust, because trust had been shaken. When physicians fled plague-stricken cities, apothecaries remained. They were local, visible, embedded, and visibility became power. Here's what most people overlook. Medicine in medieval cities was theatrical by necessity, grinding ingredients publicly, displaying rare substances, reciting Latin authorities. Each action reassured clients that knowledge still existed, that order still held. When knowledge feels uncertain, ritual becomes certainty, and ritual works best when witnessed. Ground beetles and other unusual ingredients had visual impact. They were tangible, exotic, memorable. Even if they comprised a small fraction of a compound, their presence amplified the perception of complexity. Complexity signals expertise. If the remedy appears intricate, the practitioner appears learned. And this was a competitive marketplace. In cities like Florence, Venice, and Paris, multiple apothecaries might operate within walking distance. Reputation mattered. Records from late medieval Italian cities showed disputes over adulterated ingredients and quality control. Trust was fragile currency. But here's where it gets complicated. As apothecaries gain prominence, tensions with university-trained physicians intensified. Physicians prescribed. Apothecaries prepared. But who truly understood the substance? Some physicians accused apothecaries of embellishing compounds. Some apothecaries quietly questioned physicians' detachment from practical realities. And customers noticed. Authority was not unified. It was negotiated. Imagine the relationship today between pharmaceutical researchers, supplement companies, and retail wellness stores. The lab designs, the brand markets, the storefront sells. Each claims authority. Each shapes perception. In the 14th and 15th centuries, apothecaries occupied a hybrid space. Part chemist, part merchant, part public relations expert. The jar lifted toward the light wasn't just inventory, it was branding. By the late 14th century, apothecary guilds in cities like Florence maintained detailed statutes regulating practice. Surviving guild records document fines for selling spoiled ingredients. The separation between physicians and apothecaries, formalized earlier in southern Italy under the 1240 edict, attributed to Frederick II, continued to influence professional boundaries. Manuscript recipe collections from the 14th and 15th centuries contain compound remedies blending herbs, minerals, animal products, and occasionally insect material. Historians debate the frequency and dosage of such ingredients, but the marketplace context is clear. Medical practice was public, and public practice required persuasion. Desperation reframes meaning. After plague, people did not simply want cure. They wanted confidence. The apothecary's gestures, the grinding, the measuring, the sealing, were calming rhythms in unstable times. The inclusion of rare or strange ingredients could reinforce a sense that nothing was overlooked, no corner of creation ignored. In that sense, beetle powder was not just pharmacology. It was a signal. We are using everything. Nothing is wasted. Nothing is beyond reach. So in the post-plague city, guilds regulate apothecaries. Markets become stages. Trust is rebuilt through spectacle. Insect ingredients remain part of a broader pharmacological toolkit. Authority is visible, performative, negotiated, and increasingly competitive. But as insect remedies circulate through marketplaces and manuscripts alike, another layer deepens. These creatures were not only medicinal, they were symbolic. And symbolism has a strange power. Because when you swallow something that lives in decay, you are making a statement about life. In the next section, we descend into that symbolism. A beetle crawls across a stone floor. It disappears into a crack no wider than your fingernail. You watch it vanish, and you wonder, what does something like that mean in a world obsessed with salvation? It's 1423. You're inside a dimly lit parish church in northern France. Candles flicker against painted walls where saints stand frozen in gold leaf halos. Near the entrance, a small table holds devotional objects, rosaries, prayer tokens, wax offerings. A woman kneels nearby. In her hand, wrapped in cloth, is a tiny pellet prepared by a local apothecary. It contains herbs, honey, and powdered insect, ground beetle, according to the recipe. She whispers a prayer before swallowing it. Not loudly, not theatrically, just quietly. Because for her, medicine and faith are not separate domains. They are overlapping circles. Outside, autumn leaves gather in damp corners. Beetles burrow beneath them. Decay feeds life. Life feeds decay. And the symbolism is not subtle. Medieval Europe did not see nature as neutral. Creation was allegorical. Bestiaries, illustrated texts describing animals both real and mythical, assigned moral and spiritual meanings to creatures. Though beetles were less prominent than lions or serpents in formal bestiaries, insects generally occupied a space associated with transformation, corruption, and persistence. They lived in soil, in rot, in hidden spaces. They appeared where matter broke down, but they also survived where other creatures could not. That duality mattered. Decay was terrifying in plague-ravaged Europe, but it was also understood as part of divine order. Compost feeds fields. Corruption precedes renewal. And here's the part that deepens the psychology. To consume something that thrives in decay is to symbolically master decay. You are not passively rotting. You are integrating resilience. When knowledge feels uncertain, ritual becomes certainty, and symbolism reinforces ritual. Christian theology emphasized resurrection, death followed by renewal, the body returning to dust, then rising again. Insects, especially those emerging from soil or decaying matter, fit naturally into this imaginative landscape. While medieval Europeans did not understand insect life cycles scientifically, they observed emergence, movement from hidden places, life appearing from apparent lifelessness. It blurred boundaries, and blurred boundaries are powerful in times of illness. If disease felt like corruption spreading through the body, then perhaps a creature born from corruption carried insight into reversing it, not logically in a modern biochemical sense, but symbolically coherent. But here's where it gets complicated. Symbolism cuts both ways. Insects were also associated with sin, with infestation, with divine punishment. Biblical plagues included swarms. Maggots appeared in descriptions of decay. So ingesting an insect could carry unease, a tension between healing and contamination. And that tension heightened the ritual, because overcoming disgust amplified the act. If you swallow what repels you, you demonstrate trust. Trust in the apothecary, trust in the system, trust in God's design. Think of modern wellness trends that emphasize detox. People consume substances marketed as cleansing, often dark, bitter, or charcoal-colored. There's a psychological satisfaction in ingesting something that looks powerful, even harsh. It signals seriousness, commitment. The medieval pellet containing ground beetle likely carried similar emotional weight. It wasn't candy, it wasn't comfort, it was deliberate, and deliberate acts feel meaningful. Illuminated manuscripts from the 13th and 14th centuries frequently included marginal creatures, hybrid animals, insects, fantastical beings, reflecting a worldview where the natural and symbolic intertwined. The Taquinum Sanitatis, circulating widely in the 14th century, categorized foods and substances by humoral qualities, reinforcing the systematic logic behind consumption. Vernacular medical recipe books from the 14th and 15th centuries, particularly in Italian and German regions, include occasional references to animal-based powders in compound remedies. Historians debate the exact frequency of insect ingredients relative to plant and mineral substances, but their presence reveals something larger. Medicine was not just chemical intervention. It was participation in a symbolic universe. Picture yourself again in that church, the pellet dissolving slowly. You feel watched, not by suspicion, but by expectation. The act is small, private, but layered with meaning. You are doing something. In a world where so much feels uncontrollable, doing something matters. even if the outcome is uncertain, especially if the outcome is uncertain. So now we see the deeper layer. Insects were not only categorized by humoral qualities, they carried symbolic resonance, decay and renewal, corruption and resilience, disgust and devotion. Ingesting them blurred boundaries between medicine and ritual, between theology and pharmacology, between fear and hope. But symbolism alone does not sustain authority. Structure does. And by the 15th century, as cities stabilized and universities expanded, medicine became increasingly regulated. Who could prescribe? Who could sell? Who could claim legitimacy? And what happened to remedies that straddled elite theory and popular practice? In the next section, we step into the courtroom. A wooden gavel strikes a table, not in a grand courtroom, but in a guild hall. A jar of powdered ingredients sits in the center. Its contents are under scrutiny. It's 1451. You're standing inside a guild chamber in Florence. The room is narrower than you expected. Whitewashed walls, heavy beams overhead. A long oak table dominates the center. 3 guild officials sit behind it. Before them, an apothecary. His hands are steady, but his jaw tightens. On the table sits a ceramic jar sealed with wax. The accusation: adulteration. The contents, part of a compound remedy, are being questioned. Too coarse, too impure, possibly diluted. Customers complained. Trust wavered. In this room, medicine is no longer only about theory or symbolism. It is about regulation. Because after a century of plague and upheaval, cities are rebuilding something fragile: confidence. By the 15th century, many European cities had formalized professional guilds overseeing trades, including apothecaries. Guild statutes regulated ingredient sourcing, storage standards, weight measurements, apprenticeship training, inspection schedules. In Florence, Venice, and other Italian city-states, apothecaries were periodically inspected to ensure compliance. This wasn't bureaucratic excess. It was economic necessity. Urban populations depended on trust. If remedies failed, social tension followed. And here's what matters. Insect-based remedies, when present in compounded medicines, were subject to the same scrutiny as herbs or minerals. The issue was not whether the ingredient was strange. The issue was whether it conformed to accepted standards. Legitimacy depended on structure. When knowledge feels uncertain, ritual becomes certainty. But when ritual spreads, law must follow. By the 14th and 15th centuries, university-trained physicians increasingly distinguished themselves from empirical healers and folk practitioners. University medicine emphasized textual authority. Galen, Avicenna, Aristotle. Apothecaries emphasized practical preparation. Meanwhile, local healers, often women operating within domestic spaces, maintained vernacular traditions. Remedies overlapped, but legitimacy did not. If a university physician prescribed a compound containing unusual ingredients, it carried scholastic weight. If a village healer recommended a similar preparation, suspicion could follow. The ingredient might be identical. The authority was not. Regulation created hierarchy. Hierarchy created exclusion. Women healers, midwives, and non-guild practitioners could face accusations of malpractice, or worse. Insect-based remedies appearing in domestic recipe collections might be tolerated within households, but scrutinized in public markets. And when something went wrong, when illness worsened or death followed, blame needed direction. In late medieval Europe, accusations of improper healing could intertwine with fears of superstition or illicit magic. Not always, not everywhere, but enough to matter. Consider modern health regulation. Licensed physicians, certified pharmacists, alternative medicine practitioners operating in grey areas. The substance itself is often less controversial than who administers it. Authority determines acceptability. A supplement sold in a glossy package at a national chain store feels different from the same powder handed across a kitchen table. In 15th century Europe, the guild seal functioned much like a modern regulatory stamp. It reassured, it standardized, it centralized power. Guild statutes from late medieval Italian cities survive in archival records, detailing inspection procedures and fines for adulterated goods. The separation between physician and apothecary roles, formalized earlier in regions influenced by the 1240 edict, associated with Frederick II, continued shaping professional boundaries. By the 15th century, printed medical texts began circulating more widely, following the invention of the printing press around 1450 in Mainz, accelerating standardization. Historians debate how tightly enforced guild regulations were in practice, but documentation shows active oversight. Medicine had become civic infrastructure. Imagine standing in that guild hall again. The jar opened, its contents examined, not because beetle powder is bizarre, but because consistency matters. Legitimacy transforms unusual substances into acceptable remedies. Without legitimacy, they become suspect. The difference lies not in the ingredient, but in the system supporting it, and systems are fragile. So by the mid-15th century, medicine is regulated, guilds enforce standards, universities shape doctrine, domestic healers operate at the margins. Insect-based remedies continue in layered contexts, elite, vernacular, commercial. Authority is negotiated through law, trust is institutionalized, and belief is reinforced by structure. But regulation does not erase hierarchy, it amplifies it, because not everyone in medieval Europe had equal access to licensed care. Not everyone could afford university-trained physicians. And in the countryside, far from guild halls and cathedral towers, remedies followed different paths. In the next section, we leave the city and step into the fields. Dirt under your fingernails. Beetle uncovered beneath a stone. No guild seal, no ceramic jar, just earth. And need. It's 1468. You're standing in a small village outside Lyon. The fields are damp from recent rain. The air smells of soil and livestock. Your cottage is one room. Smoke curls through a hole in the roof. There is no university here, no licensed apothecary within walking distance. When illness strikes, you turn to what is near. Your neighbor, a woman in her 40s with steady hands, kneels beside a small hearth. She grinds dried herbs with something darker mixed in. Ground insect, gathered from beneath bark and fieldstone. She learned the recipe from her mother, who learned it from hers. No Latin text accompanies the preparation, but the logic still echoes humoral balance. Drying a damp cough, warming a chilled body. Even here, theory trickles down, simplified, reshaped, absorbed. You swallow the mixture with watered ale. Not because it is exotic, because it is available. By the 15th century, Europe's social hierarchy structured access to care. Urban elites consulted university-trained physicians. Guild-regulated apothecaries prepared compounds in city markets. But rural populations relied heavily on household medicine. Recipe collections compiled in the 14th and 15th centuries often blended elite humoral concepts with practical, locally available ingredients. Historians examining vernacular medical manuscripts note this layering. Formal theory filtered downward, local practice filtered upward. Insect-based remedies appear more frequently in household collections than in elite surgical texts. Why? Because insects were accessible. Fields, forests, and homes provided material without trade networks. Scarcity shapes pharmacology, and scarcity also shapes belief. Here's what makes this psychologically complex. The same beetle might represent scholarly humoral balance in Florence and practical necessity in a village. The ingredient was identical. The context transformed its meaning. When knowledge feels uncertain, ritual becomes certainty. But when resources are limited, ritual becomes adaptation. In agrarian communities, daily life revolved around observation, weather patterns, soil conditions, animal behavior. People watched decay become fertilizer. They saw insects emerge from compost piles and dying crops. Transformation was visible. If insects could break down rot in the field, perhaps they could break down rot in the body. It was analogy rooted in lived experience. Not absurdity, but pattern recognition. And pattern recognition is one of the oldest human survival tools. But here's where it gets complicated. Class distinctions influence credibility. A remedy administered in a licensed urban shop carried institutional backing. The same remedy administered by a village healer carried vulnerability. If it worked, it was skill. If it failed, it could become suspicion. Late medieval Europe did not yet experience the full intensity of early modern witch trials, but anxieties about improper healing existed. Women healers especially occupied precarious ground. Knowledge without institutional backing was both valuable and dangerous. Consider modern disparities in healthcare access. Urban centers host advanced hospitals. Rural areas rely more heavily on local practitioners, home remedies, and community networks. The substance used may overlap. The perception differs. Today, someone using herbal supplements might be seen as natural. In another context, as unscientific. The judgment often reflects social position more than chemistry. In the 15th century, similar dynamics shape perception of insect remedies. Surviving 14th and 15th century vernacular recipe books from German and Italian regions include household remedies blending humoral logic with locally sourced materials. Historians analyzing these manuscripts note significant variation in ingredients, depending on geography and economic status. Guild records from urban centers contrast sharply with rural practice, revealing a layered medical landscape. Sources disagree on how standardized rural remedies were, but consistency in humoral terminology suggests diffusion of elite concepts. Even in cottages without manuscripts, balance remained the guiding principle. Pause for a moment. If you lived in a rural village in 1468, no doctor nearby, no printed manual, only tradition and observation. Would you trust the beetle gathered from your own field more than the powder sold in a distant city? Or does authority feel stronger when it is stamped and sealed? There is humility in rural medicine, less spectacle, more proximity. The beetle comes from your soil, the remedy from your neighbor. It feels intimate, immediate, perhaps even more trustworthy than distant Latin texts. But intimacy also isolates, and isolation magnifies fear when illness spreads. Urban medicine is regulated and theatrical. Rural medicine is adaptive and inherited. Insect-based remedies circulate more visibly in household contexts. Class shapes credibility, authority shapes perception, and access shapes belief. The same ground beetle carries different weight depending on who prepares it. But hierarchy does not only divide city and countryside, it divides men and women, public authority and private care. Because in medieval Europe, much of medicine happened behind closed doors, in kitchens, in birth chambers, in whispered instructions. And that is where our story turns next. A door closes softly. Inside, women gather around a low bed. No guild seal hangs here, no university diploma, only experience, and a small cloth bundle of powdered ingredients. It's 1482. You are inside a timber-framed house in a town near Cologne. Snow presses against the shutters. The room is warm with firelight. A young woman lies in bed, pale and sweating. Around her stand her mother, a midwife, and two neighbors. On the table rests a wooden mortar. Inside it, crushed herbs mixed with something darker. Powdered insect, gathered and dried weeks earlier. The midwife does not announce the ingredient dramatically. She folds it into honey and wine. She murmurs a prayer. She speaks calmly, because much of medieval medicine happens here, out of sight of guild halls and lecture rooms. Domestic medicine was not secondary, it was constant. Between 1100 and 1500, women played essential roles in healthcare across Europe. They served as midwives, herbalists, caregivers within households, informal healers within communities. University education was largely closed to women. Guild membership was often restricted, but practical knowledge flowed through female networks, mother to daughter, neighbor to neighbor. Vernacular medical manuscripts compiled in the 14th and 15th centuries sometimes include remedies attributed to women. Some survive with marginal notes identifying a good remedy from a certain woman. Insect-based ingredients appear occasionally within these collections, usually blended into compound remedies. Historians debate how frequently such ingredients were used relative to plants and minerals. What is clearer is this: domestic medicine blended humoral theory with embodied experience. Women may not have studied Galen formally, but the language of hot, cold, wet, and dry filtered into everyday practice. Knowledge diffused beyond universities, and within domestic spaces, ritual intensified. When knowledge feels uncertain, ritual becomes certainty. And in the intimate space of illness, ritual is deeply personal. Women's bodies, in particular, were sites of medical anxiety in medieval Europe. Menstruation, pregnancy, childbirth. These were understood through humoral imbalance and heat dynamics. Remedies aimed to regulate flow, warmth, and obstruction. Insects, associated symbolically with breaking down matter or stimulating internal movement, sometimes appeared in treatments related to digestive or reproductive concerns in vernacular texts. Sources disagree on frequency and dosage, but their symbolic logic is consistent. To stimulate movement within stagnation, to counter cold with warmth, to disrupt obstruction, it aligned with humoral arithmetic. But here's where it gets complicated. Domestic authority was powerful, but precarious. If a remedy worked, the midwife was praised. If a patient worsened, suspicion could follow. Late medieval Europe did not yet experience the full-scale witch hunts of the 16th and 17th centuries. But anxieties about improper healing, superstition, or unauthorized practice existed. Women healers navigated narrow lines between respected caregiver and potential scapegoat, and unusual ingredients, like insect powders, could either demonstrate ingenuity or invite doubt. Authority without institutional backing is always vulnerable. Think about how healthcare advice spreads today in parenting forums, wellness communities, or social media groups. Informal networks share remedies and strategies. Some align with mainstream medicine, some diverge. The line between community wisdom and misinformation often depends on who defines legitimacy. In the 15th century, similar dynamics played out in kitchens and birthing rooms. The difference was not belief versus science. It was institution versus intimacy. Medieval midwives are documented in town records across Europe, sometimes licensed by local authorities, sometimes operating informally. Vernacular German and Italian recipe books from the 15th century include remedies attributed to household experience. Church courts occasionally recorded disputes involving healers accused of improper practice, though historians caution against projecting later witch hunt intensity backward too aggressively. Evidence suggests layered coexistence between licensed urban medicine and domestic healing networks. Insect-based remedies appear sporadically within these broader compilations. They were part of the ecosystem, not dominant, not central, but present. Return to that winter room. The midwife presses the cup to the young woman's lips. She believes in what she is doing, not blindly, but sincerely. She has seen fevers break before, seen bodies recover, seen balance restored. In that room, theory is not abstract. It is embodied. Care is not theatrical. It is intimate. And intimacy creates its own kind of authority. Women as transmitters of medical knowledge. Domestic spaces as primary sites of care. Humoral logic diffused beyond universities. Insect remedies embedded within compound preparations. Authority negotiated through trust and experience. Gender shaping legitimacy. Medicine lived not only in guild halls, but in kitchens and birth chambers. But as domestic medicine continues quietly, another anxiety grows louder. Fear of corruption, fear of invisible contamination, fear that the very air carries death. And in that atmosphere of dread, insects take on new meaning. Because what crawls in decay may also symbolize the spread of it. In the next section, we confront the fear of rot itself. The smell reaches you before the sight. Sweet, sour, heavy in the throat. Someone whispers, "The air is bad." And suddenly, everything that crawls feels suspect. It's 1491. You're walking through a narrow alley in London. Rainwater runs along the gutter. Waste collects in shallow channels beside the street. A butcher's stall stands half covered, flies drifting lazily in the damp air. You pull your cloak tighter. You've heard the word miasma, bad air, corrupted vapors rising from rot. Inside a nearby apothecary shop, bundles of dried herbs hang thickly near the ceiling. Rosemary, sage, lavender, meant to sweeten the air. On a side table sits a compound remedy. Honey, wine, ground herbs, and a fine dark powder, crushed insect. The logic feels paradoxical. If insects gather where rot thrives, why would you ingest one? And yet, within medieval thought, the answer is not absurd. It is systematic. By the late medieval period, especially after repeated plague outbreaks, the theory of miasma gained prominence in European medical writing. Disease was believed to spread through corrupted air, vapors arising from decaying organic matter. Urban sanitation was limited. Waste accumulated in streets. Cemeteries filled quickly during plague years. The sensory experience of cities reinforced the theory. Rot smelled dangerous, so it must be dangerous. And here's where the intellectual structure remains intact. If disease comes from corrupted air, hot, moist, putrid, then treatment must counteract those qualities. Drying, warming, purifying. Some insect powders, categorized as dry and warm in humoral terms, fit this arithmetic. It wasn't about copying rot. It was about mastering its qualities. When knowledge feels uncertain, ritual becomes certainty. And in an atmosphere thick with fear, rituals of purification multiply. Insects occupied a strange symbolic territory. They appeared in decay, but they also consumed it. They transformed it. In a worldview without germ theory, this transformation could be interpreted as evidence of their potency. If a beetle thrives where corruption spreads, perhaps it contains within it the capacity to counteract that corruption. Not because it destroys bacteria, but because it embodies resilience in hostile environments. But here's where it gets complicated. Fear of corruption didn't stop at air. It extended to bodies, to morality, to social outsiders. If bad air caused illness, so might bad influence. During plague waves, marginalized groups were sometimes blamed for poisoning wells or spreading disease, accusations that led to violence in parts of Europe. Medical theory and social anxiety intertwined. The fear of invisible contamination created hunger for visible solutions. Grinding herbs, burning incense, swallowing pellets, doing something, anything. Think about modern fears of toxins. The language persists. Detox diets, air purifiers, cleanses. We may use different science, but the emotional logic remains similar. If something unseen harms us, we seek visible countermeasures. Bottled solutions, structured rituals, authoritative voices. The medieval response to miasma followed that same psychological pattern. Medical treatises written in the aftermath of the Black Death frequently emphasized corrupted air as a cause of illness. Cities like Venice developed early quarantine measures in the 15th century, including isolation of ships suspected of carrying disease. Urban sanitation ordinances increased in some regions during the late medieval period, attempting to reduce foul odors and waste accumulation. Vernacular remedy collections from the 15th century include aromatic compounds designed to purify air, alongside ingestible treatments aimed at restoring internal balance. Insect-based ingredients appear sporadically within these broader frameworks. Historians debate their prevalence, but not the centrality of miasma theory to late medieval medical thought. This is analogical reasoning, and analogical reasoning is powerful. Imagine breathing that damp London air, smelling rot, hearing coughing through thin walls. The fear is not abstract, it is sensory, overwhelming. In that atmosphere, swallowing a carefully prepared compound, however strange, feels like reclaiming agency. The act of ingestion becomes defiance, a refusal to be passively poisoned. It builds bridges between observation and conclusion. So by the late 15th century, miasma theory shapes urban anxiety. Corruption is sensory, moral, and medical. Insects symbolize both decay and transformation. Insect-based remedies persist within humoral logic. Fear amplifies ritual. Authority attempts to stabilize panic. And belief adapts under pressure. But fear alone does not explain persistence. Trade expands. Ships move across Mediterranean routes. Exotic substances enter European markets. And suddenly, insect remedies are no longer just local. They are part of something larger. Because when trade widens the world, medicine widens with it. A ship creaks in a Mediterranean harbour. Cargo is unloaded carefully. Spices, resins, dried creatures sealed in cloth. Somewhere in those bundles, medicine. It's 1498. You're standing on the docks of Venice. The air smells of salt and tar. Sailors shout in dialects you don't recognize. Crates are opened. Pepper from India, cinnamon from Ceylon, alum from Asia Minor. The world feels suddenly vast. Inside a nearby apothecary shop, new ingredients are displayed prominently. Rare gums, exotic powders, unfamiliar resins, and among them, dried animal and insect substances imported through expanding trade networks. Not everyday beetles from a local field, but rare, distant materials that signal something powerful. Access, connection, reach. The apothecary doesn't just sell medicine now, he sells the world. By the 14th and 15th centuries, Mediterranean trade networks linked Europe with North Africa, the Middle East, and parts of Asia. Venice and Genoa acted as crucial intermediaries. Medical knowledge traveled alongside goods. Arabic medical texts had already re-entered Europe through translation movements centuries earlier. Now physical substances followed. Materia medica expanded. Spices were not just culinary luxuries. They were medicinal commodities. Pepper warmed, cinnamon dried, myrrh purified. Exoticism reinforced authority. And here's the subtle psychological shift. If a remedy traveled far, it carried perceived potency. Distance implied rarity. Rarity implied value. Insect-based substances, whether locally sourced or imported, could gain prestige when framed within global trade. Not just ground beetle from your garden. Medieval consumers were not naive. They understood scarcity. They understood cost. An ingredient transported across seas required labor, risk, negotiation. It felt powerful because it was expensive. Records from Italian city-states document pricing structures for imported medicinal goods. Luxury compounds sometimes included ingredients sourced from distant regions. The inclusion of unusual animal or insect-derived substances could elevate a remedy's status. Not necessarily because it worked better, but because it signaled sophistication. Authority expanded geographically, but an ingredient linked to distant lands. When knowledge feels uncertain, ritual becomes certainty. And when certainty feels fragile, rarity strengthens it. But here's where it gets complicated. As trade widened, standardization strained. How do you verify authenticity of imported ingredients? How do you prevent substitution or fraud? Guild inspections grew more complex. Adulteration became a real concern. Some records from late medieval cities document disputes over misrepresented goods. Trust had to stretch across oceans, and stretching trust introduces vulnerability. Think about modern superfoods marketed as rare discoveries from remote regions. Goji berries, ate, exotic mushrooms. Their appeal often rests as much on origin story as on biochemical profile. The medieval apothecary operated within a similar logic. An imported ingredient from afar could elevate a compound's perceived legitimacy. It suggested access to wider knowledge. Global reach before globalization. By the late 15th century, Venice dominated much of the spice trade entering Europe. Port records and commercial archives document extensive trade in medicinal substances alongside culinary goods. Pharmacological texts expanded their lists of recognized ingredients as trade routes broadened. Historians debate the precise scale of insect-based imports compared to plant resins and minerals. But the larger pattern is clear. The pharmacological imagination widened with geography. Medicine became increasingly cosmopolitan. Imagine holding a small vial in Venice in 1498. You are told its contents came from beyond the Mediterranean, across deserts, across seas. The distance itself feels medicinal. It suggests that nothing in the world is beyond reach, even illness, even corruption. The remedy in your hand is not just local earth, it is global assurance. So as the 15th century closes, trade expands, pharmacology widens, rarity enhances authority, guilds struggle to maintain standards. Insect-based ingredients exist within an increasingly global materia medica. Medicine becomes both local and international, and belief stretches across oceans. But expansion carries consequences, because as ingredients multiply, so do questions. Not everyone is convinced that every rare substance belongs in a remedy, and by the dawn of the Renaissance, doubt begins to stir quietly beneath the surface. The system is still standing. A physician pauses mid-sentence. He looks at the manuscript before him, then at the patient, and for the first time, he hesitates, but his foundation is shifting. You are inside a study in Padua. A single window lets in late afternoon light. Books, printed, not handwritten, line the shelves. The page is no longer handwritten. It is printed, ink pressed by machine, and in its margins, someone has written a quiet question. But does it work? It's 1499. You are inside a scholar's study in Padua. The air smells faintly of ink and drying paper. On the desk lies something new, an identical copy of a medical text that exists in dozens, perhaps hundreds, of other rooms across Europe. Not a hand-copied manuscript, a printed book. You turn the pages. The authority feels solid, uniform, reproducible. But the man across from you, a physician trained in the university tradition, rests his fingers on the margin and frowns. He has seen plague return. He has seen treatments fail. He still believes in humoral balance, but something unsettles him. The system explains everything, yet it does not fix everything. And for the first time, explanation and outcome feel slightly misaligned. By the late 15th century, Europe was entering a period historians would later call the Renaissance. The printing press, introduced in the mid-15th century in Mainz, transformed knowledge transmission. Medical texts could now circulate widely and consistently. Standardization strengthened doctrine, but it also made comparison easier. Discrepancies became visible. Scholars began re-examining ancient authorities directly, sometimes noticing translation errors or inconsistencies. This was not rebellion, it was refinement. University curricula still centered on Galen and Aristotle. Humoral theory remained dominant. Insect-based remedies continued to appear in pharmacological lists, but a subtle shift emerged. Observation began to compete, gently, with tradition. Here's what makes this moment fascinating. Doubt did not erupt dramatically. It accumulated quietly. When knowledge feels uncertain, ritual becomes certainty. But when certainty begins to feel strained, questions emerge in the margins. For centuries, authority flowed from text downward. If Galen wrote it, it carried weight. If Avicenna preserved it, it endured. But what happens when lived experience doesn't match textual promise? Plague did not disappear. Fevers persisted. treatments sometimes failed spectacularly. Scholars in Italian universities like Padua began emphasizing anatomy more carefully. Human dissection, still controversial in some contexts, became more systematized by the late 15th century. Seeing the body directly introduced subtle tension. The humoral system remained intact, but the body seemed more complex than the text suggested. And this is where insect remedies occupy an interesting position. They were never central pillars of medical doctrine. They were components within it. As scrutiny increased, peripheral ingredients became easier to question. But here's where it gets complicated. Doubt does not dismantle systems overnight. Institutions resist abrupt change. University physicians built careers on established frameworks. Guilds regulated preparation according to accepted texts. The printing press amplified established doctrine, even as it enabled critique. So instead of collapse, what we see is negotiation. Some scholars begin emphasizing experience alongside authority. Others double down on classical fidelity. The system bends. It does not break. Consider how modern medicine evolves. A long-standing treatment remains standard practice. Then new studies raise questions. Guidelines update gradually, not instantly. Institutions resist chaos. They revise carefully. Late medieval medicine functioned similarly. The presence of unusual remedies, whether mineral, herbal, or insect-based, was not erased immediately. It was slowly contextualized, re-evaluated, sometimes sidelined, sometimes retained. The spread of printed medical texts after the 1450s accelerated intellectual exchange across Europe. Universities such as Padua gained reputations for anatomical study in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. Historians note increasing attention to direct observation during this period, though humoral theory remained dominant well into the 16th century. Recipe books and pharmacological lists continued circulating in both manuscript and print forms. Evidence suggests gradual modification rather than abrupt abandonment of older remedies. The change was evolutionary, not revolutionary. Imagine being that physician in 1499. You were trained to revere ancient authorities. Your professional identity rests on continuity. Yet you have witnessed catastrophe. You have seen remedies fail. You still prescribe according to humoral balance. You may still include traditional ingredients. But a quiet question hums beneath your certainty. What if the system is incomplete? Not wrong, incomplete. That is a destabilizing thought. So at the edge of 1500, the printing press standardizes knowledge. Universities emphasize renewed textual study. Anatomical observation grows more visible. Humoral theory persists. Insect-based remedies remain within pharmacological lists, but are no longer unquestioned. Doubt begins not as rebellion, but as refinement, and refinement leads somewhere, because once observation gains confidence, once authority is gently interrogated, medicine begins to shift its center of gravity. Ritual does not disappear, but it must compete with something new, experience. And in the next section, that competition becomes visible. A scalpel touches skin, not in secrecy, but in a university hall. Students lean forward, watching, learning from what is seen, not only from what is written. It's 1502. You are standing in an anatomical theatre in northern Italy. The room is circular. Tiered wooden benches rise around a central table. Candles flicker in iron, sconces along the wall. At the center, a body lies prepared for dissection. A physician gestures with measured calm, explaining structures as he reveals them. Students scribble notes. The air is tense, focused. Here, knowledge is shifting slightly, from commentary on ancient texts to commentary on the body itself. Outside this hall, apothecaries still grind compounds. Household healers still mix remedies. Insect powders have not vanished. But something has changed. The body is becoming evidence. By the early 16th century, European medicine began tilting gradually toward direct anatomical observation. This did not erase humoral theory. Balance remained central. But physicians increasingly supplemented inherited doctrine with visual confirmation. The Renaissance emphasis on returning to the sources encouraged scholars to re-examine classical texts in original languages and compare them with lived experience. Anatomy complicated simplicity. The body was intricate, layered, mechanical in ways humoral theory had not fully articulated. Here's what makes this transition subtle. Ritual did not disappear. It coexisted with observation. When knowledge feels uncertain, ritual becomes certainty. But when knowledge begins to stabilize through evidence, ritual must justify itself differently. Insect-based remedies, never the core of doctrine, became easier to question in this environment, not because they were scandalous, but because they were peripheral. Peripheral ideas are often the first to face scrutiny. No council banned beetle powder. No edict outlawed insect remedies in 1502. What happened instead was quieter. Medical printing expanded standardized pharmacopoeias. Ingredients that aligned clearly with emerging observational frameworks retained prominence. Others receded. Some insect-derived substances persisted in specific treatments. Others faded from elite texts, while remaining in vernacular practice. Historians debate the pace and geography of this shift. It was uneven, layered, non-linear, but the direction is visible. Authority slowly recentered around what could be demonstrated. But here's where it gets complicated. Observation introduced its own fragility. Dissections were limited. Cadavers were scarce. Anatomy revealed structure, but not always cause. Disease mechanisms remained mysterious. Humoral logic continued offering explanatory coherence. So physicians navigated dual frameworks, ancient balance, emerging empiricism. Ritual preparation did not vanish. It adapted. The apothecary still measured, still sealed jars, still displayed rare ingredients. But the justification shifted subtly, from symbolic alignment toward practical effect. Think of how certain traditional remedies today survive scientific scrutiny. Some are validated, others are reframed as placebo-supported or culturally significant. A few quietly disappear from mainstream medicine while persisting in alternative spaces. The late medieval to early modern transition mirrors this dynamic. It was not dramatic rejection. It was reclassification. By the early 16th century, anatomical teaching in Italian universities gained increasing prominence. Printed pharmacological compendia standardized ingredient lists more widely than manuscript culture allowed. Historians note gradual movement toward observational emphasis in medical training. Though humoral theory remained influential for centuries, evidence suggests that unusual animal-based ingredients, including insects, appeared less frequently in formalized elite medical print culture over time, though regional and domestic practices retained variety. Change did not erase the past, it layered over it. Imagine being a physician in 1502. You learned humoral theory, You believe in balance. You have prescribed compound remedies your entire career. But now you watch anatomy unfold before you. Muscle fibers, organs, networks of vessels. The body looks more mechanical than symbolic, not less sacred, but differently organized. And in that reorganization, some ingredients lose their emotional anchor. The beetle is no longer divine metaphor. It is material, and material demands evidence. So now we see the pivot. Observation gains authority. Printing standardizes knowledge. Humoral theory persists, but is refined. Inst-based remedies shift from symbolic weight toward practical scrutiny. Ritual and evidence coexist uneasily. The system bends again, not broken, but evolving. And evolution has consequences, because once medicine begins redefining itself, old practices do not simply vanish. They linger, they transform, they resurface in new forms. In the next section, we follow what happens to insect remedies as Europe crosses fully into the early modern world. A jar is pushed to the back of a shelf, not discarded, just less prominent. Dust gathers slowly, but it is never completely gone. It's 1534. You're inside an apothecary shop in Antwerp. Printed books now sit beside ceramic jars. Woodcut illustrations decorate title pages. The shop feels more organized, more standardized than it did a century earlier. A customer requests a remedy for persistent stomach pain. The apothecary consults a printed pharmacopoeia. He selects herbs, minerals, resins. He hesitates briefly at a jar containing dried insect fragments. He considers, then closes the lid. For this prescription, he chooses something else. Not because insects are forbidden, but because the center of authority has shifted. By the early 16th century, European medicine had not abandoned humoral theory, but it had entered a period of transformation. Printing accelerated standardization. Anatomical studies expanded. Scholars increasingly compared classical authorities with direct observation. New chemical philosophies, especially later in the century with figures like Paracelsus, would challenge aspects of Galenic orthodoxy. But even before radical reformers emerged, a gradual recalibration was underway. Pharmacopoeias became more systematic. Ingredients were catalogued with increasing emphasis on consistency in sourcing. Unusual animal-derived substances did not disappear overnight. Some persisted in specific regional practices. Others remained in folk medicine. But in elite academic circles, emphasis began shifting toward reproducibility and clarity. Peripheral ingredients, especially those symbolically rich but empirically ambiguous, were easier to set aside. When knowledge feels uncertain, ritual becomes certainty. But when knowledge begins to reorganize around observation, ritual must adapt or retreat. Yet decline in elite texts does not equal extinction. Domestic medicine continued evolving independently of universities. In rural communities, remedies passed through generations. Insects remained accessible, affordable, embedded in local knowledge systems. And even in urban settings, some apothecaries retained traditional compounds for customers who trusted them. Belief does not evaporate simply because a new framework emerges. It lingers in practice, in memory, in habit. But here's where it gets complicated. As Europe entered the early modern period, skepticism increased. Printed polemics critiqued older authorities. Medical reformers argued for new chemical understandings of disease. What once felt cosmically ordered now faced philosophical fracture. And in moments of intellectual upheaval, some practices were rebranded as outdated. Others were defended fiercely. Insect remedies, never central pillars, often faded quietly rather than becoming battleground issues. But their fading tells us something profound. Medical systems rarely collapse dramatically. They shed layers. Consider how certain treatments fall out of favor today, once mainstream, later questioned. Eventually, reserved for niche contexts or alternative communities. The shift feels gradual, almost imperceptible, until decades later, it seems obvious. Medieval insect medicine followed a similar arc. It was never the dominant headline, but it reflected the worldview of its time. And as that worldview changed, so did its place. By the mid-16th century, printed pharmacopoeias and medical texts circulated widely across Europe. Anatomical publications increased in sophistication. Medical reformers in the later 16th century openly critiqued aspects of Galenic tradition. Historians emphasized that humoral theory remained influential well into the 17th century, but increasingly alongside competing models. Evidence suggests gradual narrowing of officially endorsed ingredients in standardized texts, though vernacular practice remained diverse. Change was layered, not abrupt. Imagine that apothecary in Antwerp again. He does not feel revolutionary. He feels practical. He adjusts to what sells, what is taught, what is trusted. He keeps the jar of insect fragments, but he reaches for it less often, because authority now leans elsewhere, not dramatically, quietly. The shelf shifts. So as Europe moves beyond 1500, printing reshapes knowledge, observation gains ground, reform movements challenge orthodoxy, insect remedies decline in elite prominence but persist in domestic contexts. The system evolves by shedding peripheral layers. Belief adapts, authority recalibrates, and medicine continues forward, never static. But before we close this journey, we need to step back, because it would be easy, too easy, to dismiss beetle powder as ignorance, to laugh at cockroach pills as medieval absurdity, and that would miss the point entirely. In our final section, we ask the uncomfortable question: are we really so different? A capsule rests in your palm, smooth, opaque, branded. You don't know exactly what's inside, but you trust the label. It's not 1284. It's not 1499. It's now. You're standing in a brightly lit pharmacy. Shelves stretch in symmetrical rows. Bottles promise immunity, balance, cleansing, optimization. You scan ingredients you cannot pronounce. You read claims rooted in research you haven't personally verified. You swallow anyway, because systems tell you it makes sense. Now shift backward. A narrow apothecary shop in Bologna. A pellet sealed in wax. Ground beetle folded into honey and wine. You swallow, because systems tell you it makes sense. The centuries between those two moments are vast, but psychologically, they are closer than we like to admit. From 1100 to 1500, European insect-based remedies existed within a coherent intellectual framework. Humoral balance, theological purpose, guild regulation, trade networks, symbolic meaning. They were not random acts of desperation. They were structured responses to limited knowledge and immense vulnerability. Here's the central question we've been circling for 5 hours. Why did people believe this made sense? Because within their model of reality, it did. If disease was imbalance, drying substances restored order. If corruption spread through air, purifying compounds defended the body. If God created every creature with purpose, insects carried potential. If authority performed confidence, ritual reinforced trust. When knowledge feels uncertain, ritual becomes certainty. And medieval Europe lived with constant uncertainty: war, plague, famine, limited anatomy, no microbiology. The desire for coherence was not foolish, it was human. It is tempting to frame the medieval world as irrational, but that comparison flatters us. Our models have changed. Our microscopes see what theirs could not. Our antibiotics work where their compounds failed. But our psychological patterns remain. We still seek authoritative voices, trust structured systems, respond to fear with ritual, associate rarity with potency, equate complexity with expertise. Luxury skincare lines promise cellular renewal. Influencers promote detox regimens. Supplements trend based on preliminary studies. The language differs. The architecture is familiar. But here's where it gets complicated. Modern science is not equivalent to medieval humoral theory. One is empirically validated in ways the other was not. Outcomes matter. Evidence matters. Lives are saved today that could not be saved in 1348. The point is not equivalence. It is continuity of psychology. Systems evolve. Human vulnerability does not. And in moments of crisis, pandemics, environmental fear, health scares, we still watch belief stretch towards certainty, sometimes wisely, sometimes recklessly. Consider the surge of alternative remedies during modern public health crises. When official guidance shifts, uncertainty widens. People search for control, for something to swallow, for something to do. The medieval pellet of ground beetle and honey functioned within that same emotional landscape. An act against helplessness. An assertion that imbalance can be corrected, that corruption can be countered, that decay can be transformed. Between 1100 and 1500, European medicine evolved gradually, from manuscript preservation to printed standardization, from monastic scriptoria to university theatres. Insect-based remedies appeared within vernacular recipe collections and occasionally within broader pharmacological traditions. Historians debate their frequency and regional variation, but their presence reflects a world attempting coherence under constraint. By the early modern period, observational emphasis increased, and certain peripheral ingredients receded from elite practice. The transformation was layered, not abrupt. Medicine did not leap from darkness to light. It moved through gradations. Return one last time to that apothecary in 1284. The mortar grinding. The candlelight. The pellets sealed carefully. He believed he was helping you, not performing cruelty, not indulging absurdity, helping. He worked within the best system available to him. And so do we. That is the humbling thread connecting centuries. When knowledge feels uncertain, ritual becomes certainty. The ritual changes, the need does not. We have walked through humoral logic, monastic preservation, plague desperation, guild regulation, rural adaptation, domestic medicine, miasma fear, trade expansion, Renaissance doubt, gradual transformation. We saw how ground beetles and cockroach fragments were never merely bizarre curiosities. They were products of a worldview that sought order in chaos, balance in sickness, meaning in decay. So here's the final question. If future historians examined our medicine today, what would they find strange? Which of our rituals would feel symbolic rather than scientific? Which capsules would seem like beetle powder in hindsight? History is not a museum of foolishness. It is a mirror, and sometimes it reflects more than we expect. If you stayed for this entire journey into medieval medicine, thank you. If you're drawn to these slow, immersive explorations of overlooked history, consider liking the video and subscribing. Next, we may descend into another strange corner of the past, perhaps into the world of medieval relic economies, or the psychology of alchemy. Until then, look closely at what you swallow, and ask yourself why it makes sense.